guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today we are going to be talking about all of the series in 2021 that I DNF'd, completed, I'm up to date on, or have still yet to finish. Grab yourself a snack because there are 50 of them. So this is my nightmare video, my big video of shame. I never used to be like this with series. I used to read them start to finish before I started a new one. However, since I started a booktube channel, that is not the case, and I am going to be making a 2022 goals video regarding like reading, channel, all of that kind of stuff. And I think I'm going to put something in it about series because I have actually, like at the end of the video that I made last year that was the same as this, I said that I wanted to have less series to talk about when I made this installment, and I have one less series to talk about in this installment than I did last year. So I have made a mid-year series check-in version of this video as well, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to get through this one, because what I am going to be telling you in this video is a little bit about the series and also my very brief thoughts on them. But all of the series that I made progress on in 2021 that I have already talked about in that mid-year installment, I will only be mentioning briefly in this video. So if you want more of a synopsis, more information about what these are about, I will link both mid-year installments, because I do one talking about everything I've completed and one talking about everything that I'm in the middle of. I'll link both of them in my description box for you guys. If you know that I'm in the middle of a series and I don't mention it in this video, it means that I have not made any progress on it in 2021. So I always get a lot of questions about the True Blood series, the Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlotte Harris. I haven't read any books in that series in 2021, so it won't be mentioned here. And this video is also going to be split up into 6 sections. So the first one is DNFs, so the series that I've decided I'm not going to be continuing. The second one is all of the series that I've completed. The third and fourth are two halves of the same thing. They are going to be series that I'm up to date on that don't have a release date for 2022. The next book may still be released in 2022. It's just that there's no release date been mentioned or available with the book on Goodreads. The other half of that is series that I'm up to date on that do have a release date for the next book in 2022. And then the fifth and sixth sections, once again, two halves of the same thing. The first one is all of the series that I'm in the middle of that are completed series, so everything has been published, I just haven't read it. And then the final section is going to be series that I'm not up to date on but are still ongoing. I think to make it easier, if you want to skip between the sections, I am going to chapter this one, so if there's anything in particular you want to see, go ahead and check that out. But we are going to get cracking on this video, starting off with the smallest section, which is all of the series that I've decided that I don't want to continue. So I do have 5 of these in total. 3 of them I have already mentioned in that mid-year installment, the first one being the Children of the Fallen series, which is a new adult fantasy romance series featuring Nephilim. The second is the Bound to the Fae series. This one is once again an indie new adult fantasy romance series, and this one is a reverse harem containing fae. And the final one that I've already mentioned is the Bethel series by Alexis Henderson. This one is an adult horror duology, I think, that centers around witches. So for the ones that I haven't mentioned, the first series I've decided to DNF is the Married to Magic series by Elise Cover, the first book being A Deal with the Elf King. This is a series of indie new adult fantasy romances where each book is a standalone, but it's the same kind of book thematically. I was going to continue and try another book in this series, but I just didn't like this one. I was actually very disappointed by it because I love myself an indie fantasy romance. The cover of this is stunning. It's elves, which are very similar to fae, which is my favorite like niche of fantasy romance. But this was just a very basic entry-level kind of fantasy romance book, and in this book we're following a girl who lives in the small town that's adjacent to the kingdom of the elves, and every so many hundred years the elf king comes and he takes a human bride. The main character is selected to be that human bride, however she doesn't want to be, so she tries to find a way out of it, and it is a romance between the two. I thought that the pacing on this was very slow and I just wasn't into it, so I'm not going to continue. But if you are very new to fantasy romance, you might enjoy this. The other series I've decided to DNF is the Lifelike series by J. Kristoff. This one is a young adult post-apocalyptic sci-fi that is also an Anastasia retelling, and it follows this girl who participates in Robot Wars in her spare time to make money to pay for her grandfather's medicine, I think. And one day she uncovers a Lifelike, which is this series of androids that were discontinued because they essentially became too intelligent and wanted to overthrow their human masters, and she starts to discover some things about herself along the way. I don't like the setting in this series, and I don't love J. Kristoff's writing style in the young adult that he writes by himself, but this did have some really good plot twists at the end, so I decided to continue with the sequel. I tried to read the sequel in 2021 and I DNF'd it because I just don't care enough, so I'm definitely going to be putting this series down for now. Doubt I'm gonna ever continue. Moving on to the series that I completed in 2021, whether this means that I started and finished them in 2021 or I'd already started them prior to the start of the year and had just finished them out in the past year. There are 9 of these in total. 6 of them I have already talked about in those previous installments, and the first one of those is the Brown Sisters trilogy by Talia Hibbert, which is a series of adult romances. We then have the Life Ship Traders and the Tawny Man trilogy by Robin Hobb. These are the second and third trilogies in the realm of the Adlings. They are both adult epic fantasies and they are amongst my favourite books ever, really. Robin Hobb's now one of my favourite authors. We then have the Bargainer series by Laura Thalassa. This is the second book. I lent the first book out to a friend and I still don't have it back. Any video that I mention this series, I say that because he hasn't given me my book back yet. But this is a indie fairy romance series and it's one of my favourite fantasy romance series. We also have Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. So I haven't read Mistborn Era 2 yet, but as they are differentiated between Era 1 and Era 2, I have completed the trilogy that makes up Era 1, and this is an adult epic fantasy series and also one of my favourite series. And then the last of the ones that I've already mentioned, we have the Merciful Crow duology by Margaret Owen. This one is a young adult fantasy duology. So for the ones that I haven't mentioned, the first one is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, which is the series that should never have become a series. This one is an adult virtual reality sci-fi where the world is a terrible place to be, so everybody plugs in to this virtual reality called the Oasis. The creator of the Oasis died a few years prior to the start of this story, and he left an Easter egg hunt in the Oasis, and whoever managed to solve all of the clues would inherit all of James Halliday's estate and also control of the Oasis. So book 1 follows our main character Wade Watts as he uncovers the first Easter egg, and from then on it is a race to see who can complete the Easter egg hunt first. There is a sequel to this book that I read this year. I think I read this in 2018. I read the sequel in 2021. It was very unnecessary. It had inaccurate information in it. It was very indulgent, very info dumpy. Did not have a good time. This is still one of my favorite books ever, but Ready Player 2 was not. I also did 2 installments of a vlog series I started, which is where I read an entire series in a week. The first one of those that I did was for the Ember Quartet by Sabaa Tahir. This one is a young adult multi-perspective fantasy, and I would say like our predominant main character is a girl called Laya, whose grandparents are brutally murdered and her brother is arrested for treason. So she joins a rebellion and ends up working undercover at this prestigious military academy to try and find information that will help the rebellion release her brother. There's a lot more than that in this series. There's also some magical elements that come into it. We also follow a guy called Elias, who is one of the most skilled people at this military academy, and later in the series we follow my favorite character, who is Helene, who is the most brutal badass bitch I have ever met. I enjoyed this series. Hasn't really impacted me too much. There were a couple of low points throughout the series. I really enjoyed the first book. I enjoyed the conclusion of the last book, and the second book was pretty good as well. But as soon as we started to turn away from this martial fantasy element and more magical elements were introduced into the series, the less interested I got. I didn't find some of the characters' reactions to things very believable. They kind of just seemed to be going with the flow, not really reacting to these weird wonderful things that were happening around them. But I'm glad that I finally read this one. And the last series I completed is my second series in a week series, which is the Bone Witch trilogy by Rinch Pecco. This one is a young adult fantasy trilogy following a young girl called Taya, who is a bone witch or a necromancer. So her brother was conscripted into the army. He went to war, he died, his body was sent back to his family, and Taya, without knowing that she had these abilities and knowing what she was doing, raised him from the dead. So another bone witch called Michaela comes to take Taya away so that she can be trained in her skills. It's kind of like Memoirs of a Geisha in a fantasy setting, also a little bit like Interview with the Vampire, in that we have 2 timelines. One of them is the past timeline where Taya's discovered she has these powers and training, etc. And the other one is present day, where Taya has been outcast for doing these terrible, atrocious things. However, we don't know what it is that she's done, and it's this contrast between the well-intentioned, more naive person she was in the past and this really like bitter, jaded, vengeful person that she's become in the present day. I did really like this series. My only kind of criticism of it is that I wish that that dual timeline would have ended, because it goes all the way to the end of the series, and I wish the past timeline had caught up to the present timeline a little bit earlier, like for the third book or halfway through the third book, because I then felt that a lot of the glimpses we were having of the present were ruining impactful things or spoiling impactful things that happened in the past. But I did really enjoy this one. We will move on to the series that I'm currently up to date on, but as of yet there is no 2022 release date for the next book in the series. So I do only have 4 of those, and 3 of them I have already spoken about. The first one is Isola by Brendan Fletcher and Carl Kerschel. This is a comic book series. The first 2 volumes have been published. I read the second one this year, but there doesn't seem to have been any issues published past what's contained in the second volume. So I'm unsure whether this series is still continuing. It's definitely not complete. It doesn't end in a place where it's a complete series, but it may not exist anymore. We then have The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I reread the first 3 books in this series in 2020, then read the 2021 release at the beginning of the year, and I expect it will be at least 2023 before the next book is published. And this one is an adult dystopian but also alternate history with clairvoyancy and also a couple of paranormal elements as well. And the last one that I've already mentioned is the Akatar series by Sarah J Maas. This one is a young adult fairy romance, but as the books go on they do go into new adult, and I've read all these like many years ago and reread them multiple times, but I read the new installment of Court of Silver Flames in 2022. And the one that I haven't spoken about may have a sequel in 2022. I'm doubtful that it will though, and that is Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. So this is his first book in his new adult fantasy trilogy, and in this one we are following a guy called Gabriel, who is the last Silver Saint. The Silver Saints are a religious order that are tasked with fighting back against the forces of darkness, and this story is told in multiple timelines, but in the most present one the sun set 30 years ago and has not risen since, and so vampires have started to rise up, organize themselves, and are working on eradicating humanity, and nothing stands between them and their goal aside from the Silver Saints. In the present day timeline, Gabriel has been captured for assassinating the Forever King, who is the king of the vampires, and before they execute him they want him to tell his life story as he is the final Silver Saint, so that all of the knowledge of the Silver Saints doesn't get lost. So this has 2 past timelines. The first is the origin of Gabriel's story as he joins the Silver Saints and trains with them, and the second is his pursuit for the Holy Grail, which is a holy item that is prophesied to bring the return of the sun and get rid of the vampires. Well, not once and for all, but banish them to the night again, at least. I did really enjoy this one. There were things about it I didn't like the world building felt a little bit clunky. The religion is very obviously modelled off Christianity, and I don't like reading about real world religion in fiction, so that bothered me a little bit. As somebody who's read most of Jay Kristoff's books, I didn't find the plot twist to be especially shocking, as it's kind of things that I would expect from him, but I grew closer to the character of Gabriel throughout this, so I am excited to continue. Fingers crossed the next book will be a 5-star read for me, because I thought that this was going to be 5 stars. So I have like 4 special edition copies, and if the next book isn't 5 stars, I'm going to be getting rid of a whole ton of those. I have 9 series that I'm currently up to date on, but have sequels that are going to be released in 2022, and 4 of them I have spoken about previously. The first one is the Blood and Ash series by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This one is an indie fantasy romance series. I have read all 3 books in this series so far, and the 4th book, which I think is going to be called The War of Two Queens, is going to be published in, I think it's March. We then have The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle L. Jensen. This one is another new adult indie fantasy romance. I've read the first 2 books that have been published in this series so far. There is a third, I think, that's already out, but before it comes out in physical, it comes out as an Audible exclusive for around a year, and the physical copy of book 3 isn't out yet, which is why I haven't read it, and I'm not considering it as a series that I'm behind on because I'm waiting for the print copy. We also have The Ravens by Cass Morgan and Danielle Page. This one is a young adult contemporary fantasy, but it's very much like a witchy slasher type book. I read this one when it was released at the beginning of 2021, and the sequel is out January 2022, and I do have an arc of it, so I'll be finishing this one up pretty soon, as it is just a duology as well. And the last one of the ones that I've already mentioned is the Witchland series by Susan Dennard. I read all 4 books and the novella in this series in 2021. I think there's only 1 more book to be released in this series. On Goodreads it says 2022. Whether I believe that or not is a different matter. I'm not sure about this one, but as it has a release date for 2022, I figured I should put it in this category. For the ones I haven't spoken about, we have Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This is a bind up of a webcomic, and this is just a young adult contemporary romance between two boys. That is it. Like, it's super basic, but it's super sweet. Really, really cute. I really, really love this series. It just gives me all those cute, warm, fuzzy feelings that I don't get from the majority of the books that I read, because I read like grimdark fantasy, but I actually really appreciate in a comic format. I don't think that we're getting volume 5 of this in 2022. I think we're getting a yearbook. I don't exactly know what that entails. Don't know if I'm going to pick it up if it's not the next installment, but there is something coming out in this series in 2022, I believe. We have the Scholomance series by Naomi Novik, which is a series that I adore and despise in equal measure. This is a magic school story. It's a young adult fantasy set in this magic school that children go to because the real world is a very dangerous place for them, because there are monsters in the world called Maleficara that eat magic users, and essentially children are more vulnerable and the perfect targets for these monsters because they're untrained in their abilities. The only problem with this school is that while it is warded to keep the monsters out, there was a malfunction in the graduation hall, which means that to exit this school you have to fight your way out of a room full of monsters, and to do that you either need to form an alliance or join an enclave. I read the second book in 2021. The final book, which I think is it called the Golden Enclaves, is going to be released in summer, I think, 2022. I love the setting and the idea, the concept of this series. I really, really love the main characters of Elle and Orion, but I hate the writing style in here with a fiery passion. It's a conversational style, which isn't my preference, but I don't overly dislike it. But it's also just got endless cutaway exposition where the main character will be halfway through a thought and then go off on a 4-page tangent about something that isn't relevant to the plot of the story, that's like a fun fact in the world building, and it drives me wild. So yeah, I love this series, hate this series, will be finishing it. We also have The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This is the first book in a trilogy, I think. It is an adult dark academia story. It's a magical dark academia about these 6 very gifted magical people who are the best in their respective fields. So we have like 2 people who do like magical physics. I think we have at least 1 empath, 1 telepath, and they are gathered together by this guy called Atlas Blakely and offered entry into the Alexandrian Society. However, as soon as they enter, they know that only 5 of them are going to make it. So throughout this book, they're essentially all just like not trusting each other, because they know at the end of this 1-year period, only 5 of them are actually going to make it through to the Alexandrian Society. Not long after I picked this up and read it, the book got a traditional publishing contract with, I think it's Tor. So this is being re-released in March in a new shiny hardback, and I think the sequel is going to be out towards the end of 2022. Next up we have All of Us Villains by Amanda Foody and Christine Lynn Herman. Similar to the Atlas 6, this follows a group of 7 teenagers. Every 20 years, 1 eligible teenager from these 7 magical families is put in a tournament ground where they have to fight to the death, and whoever survives is the one who will gain the control of the high magic for their family. So the point of this is that they're all like villainous, horrible people, as I suspected going into this, because it is like more on the YA side, although it is a little bit dark. They're not all extremely villainous, but throughout the course of this book they start to edge into more of a villainous light. So I'm really excited for the sequel to this. I think it's only going to be a duology, and I'm assuming, as this was released in November, that the duology is going to be way towards the end of 2022. And the final series for this section is Lore Olympus by Rachel Smith. This is a bind up of the webcomic. You can read all of this on Webtoon, or all of it that is out to date, which is like way over 200 episodes, and this is only the first 50. This is a modernized Hades and Persephone romance retelling, but it also has a whole ton of other Greek gods in it as well, like Poseidon, Zeus, Aphrodite, Eros, Hera. I think Athena is in here as well. One of my favorite books of the year. Really enjoyed this because it's 400 pages of mutual pining. I am desperate to continue, and the only reason, well, there's a couple of reasons why I'm not reading this as a webtoon. One is I don't like to read comics or anything that has pictures on a screen, but also I don't want to fall down a massive rabbit rabbit hole with this, where I've read everything up to date and then I fall into a slump because I don't have any more to read, and I'm also up to date, so I'm not very good at following them weekly. I prefer to read them in chunks, so I think I'm just going to wait till the bind-up is published, and I think volume 2 is scheduled to be released in July. So now we move on to the section of this video that is the largest, which is the series that I have to continue. Fingers crossed I get rid of a lot of these, like I've finished a lot of these in 2022. I can't anymore. This is a big stack. The first part of this is going to be the series that I've started that are all completed. So there will be no further books published in this series as far as I'm aware. There are 14 of these in total, and 7 of them I've spoken about previously. The first one of those is Dreaming Sun by Ichigo Takano, which is a young adult or shoujo contemporary romance manga series, and I have read 4 installments. I think there's 10 in total. I've read 4, and I think 2 of them I read in 2021. We then have the Fever series by Karen Marie Moning. This one is an adult like urban fantasy paranormal romance series, and this one I've only read the first book. I think there's 7 out so far, but there's also a spin-off series, and there's been a book in this series published either last year or in 2020, so I don't know if there's intended to be any more, but it is pretty much completed, I think. We also have The Kingmaker Chronicles by Amanda Boucher. This one is an adult fantasy romance series based on Greek myth. I've only read the first book out of the trilogy. There is going to be a spin-off series of this. The first book is going to be published at the end of 2022, but I think that's more of a separate thing because it's a spin-off, so I'm counting this as just like one trilogy, and all of those 3 books have been published. We also have the Wicked Villain series by Katie Robert. This is a series of adult erotic BDSM romances, and I have read 4 of the 6 published. We also have the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence, which is an adult grimdark assassin fantasy. This also has a spin-off series, but the core trilogy is separate, and I've read 2 out of the 3. We also have the Fae Chronicles by Amelia Hutchins. This is an indie fairy romance, but more of like a contemporary urban fantasy type one. This has 7 books in the series. I've only read the first one, and it is one of those I'm unsure whether it's completed, but I'm pretty sure it is. And the final one that I've mentioned before is the Demon Cycle by Peter V. Brett. This one is an adult epic fantasy series. I've read the first book, and I think there's 6 or 7 in the series, and I do think that there is a spin-off series or something related to this series, but again I think that's separate from the core series. For the ones I haven't mentioned, we have, is it the Books of Babel is what this series is called, by Josiah Bancroft. The first book being Senlin Ascends. The final book in this series was published in 2021, and this is a story of a man who goes on his honeymoon with his wife to the Tower of Babel, and as soon as he gets there he loses his wife and assumes that she's gone into the tower, so he goes into the tower to try and find her, and on every floor of this tower there's something different, so it's him just like going up the floors of the tower looking for his wife. My enjoyment of this book very much depended on which floor he was on, because the floors are all themed differently, so I think my favorite floor was the second one, but I really didn't like the third. This is also not explicitly a historical fantasy, but it has a very Victorian steampunky kind of feel to it, which is once again not my favorite. So I think I'm going to continue the series and try the second book, because I have heard it gets better, but this series also may not be for me. We then have The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang. I'm pretty sure that this is a trilogy and there might be some spin-offs come in, but this is a series of contemporary romances. All of the books I think in this trilogy have autism rep. This one in particular is about a woman called Stella who is on the spectrum, and she's not very good with people. She doesn't know much about love and relationships or romance, so she hires a male escort to essentially teach her about all of these things. While these are romances, I was very surprised when I read this, because I would say it's more of a contemporary and that it deals with a lot of hard-hitting stuff, and I think that's true for all of the series. So do just know when you're going into this that it's not 100% a light fluffy romance. There are some more difficult things in there as well. This year I also started the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've only read book 1 so far. You guys know more about this than I do, but it is about this group of people who are trying to get the One Ring to Mordor to, I think they're trying to destroy it. I have a hard time with Lord of the Rings. I've tried to watch the movies and they just don't stick. I tried to read this physically and it just didn't stick. Listen to the audio, didn't stick. Don't know what it is about this series, but it just will not lodge itself into my brain no matter what format I try. But the audiobooks narrated by Andy Serkis are a real good time. They're real good to listen to. So I do think I'm going to continue with the series, listening to it on audio, but I'm not really going to be reviewing it on my channel because I just can't. I don't know why. It's such a weird feeling because I've experienced this story, I would say at least 5 or 6 times in different formats. Could not tell you a single thing about it. I know who the characters are, I retain about that much information, but that is literally it. We then have The Dark Eyes Duology by Karina Halley. This one is an adult paranormal vampire romance following this woman who is a vampire, but she does not know that she is. When she was a baby, the people who she thinks are her parents and are witches killed her actual parents, who are vampires, and raised the main character as their own. She has no idea about the paranormal world at all up until she's approaching, I think it's probably her 21st birthday, when she is kidnapped by this big old powerful vampire, and he teaches her like who she is, what she is, and all about the paranormal world. This was pretty much just about the main character learning to be a vampire and also getting to know this big brooding vampire guy. Not a huge fan of this book, didn't love it, but I do have the sequel, and as it's just a duology I will finish it out because there was something like the second half of this was better than the first, so because of that I'm willing to continue and see the series out. We also have the Rainwild Chronicles, which is the 4th series in the realm of the Eldlings. This one is an adult epic fantasy like the rest of the realm of the Eldlings, and I can't tell you too much about it because a lot of this series hinges on what happens at the end of the Live Ship Traders. But in this one we have a group of young dragons who are supposed to be being looked after by a group of humans. However, as the dragons are getting a little bit older, they're getting more boisterous and destructive. Dragons have no respect for humans at all. So the humans that are supposed to be looking after them are pretty much fed up of them. The dragons are feeling restless. They want to move on from this place where they've been their entire lives. So a group of people who essentially have nothing for them at home and no reason to stay there are tasked with the job of transporting these dragons to a more suitable location. I'm currently, at the time of filming this, halfway through the second book. There's a lot of publishing issues within this series and I feel like it shows, but I just find Robin Hobb's writing really comforting at this point, so even if I didn't like the plot of the books very much, I just very much find her writing soothing. This one is multi-perspective like the Live Ship Traders, which is my preference with Robin Hobb, and because of the publishing issues in this I can't really tell you my thoughts on it so far because this and the second book were intended to be published as one book but they were split in half. So my problem with this is that it has a very anticlimactic ending and I haven't finished the second book yet, which is intended to be the second half of this, so I don't really have too many conclusive thoughts, but I'm enjoying the atmosphere and the tone, being back in this world, and as it's multi-perspective I do prefer Robin Hobb's multi-perspective books as well. We then have the Starbound trilogy by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. This is a young adult sci-fi series that is pretty much very similar to Illumicrate and the Aurora Cycle by Amy Kaufman and Jake Kristoff. They're all just kind of like the same thing again. It's odd actually because like Illumicrate, this is a trilogy where each book follows a different couple, and in this one we are following Lilac and Tava. Lilac is the daughter of like the most influential businessman in the universe, and Tava is a war hero who pretty much comes from nothing. So these two meet on this luxury space liner. She snubs him and they get into a little bit of an argument, but they kind of have to leave all that behind them when the space liner crashes onto the surface of an uninhabited planet, and they have to team up to be able to survive. I've only read the first book in this series so far, and a lot of this first book was survival, which I didn't find particularly compelling, but I think in terms of it being a YA series that is mainly driven by romance, it delivered a decent angsty YA romance, and by the end of it I did enjoy it. I'm just concerned because it took me so long to get into it, and the second book follows a different couple. I don't know how I'm going to feel about the second book, but I'm going to be continuing. I did have a good time with this one. And the last one for this section is The Dark Artifices by Cassandra Clare. This is Cassandra Clare's third series in the Shadowhunters world, and if you don't know about the Shadowhunters world, it follows a group of Nephilim, so half humans, half angels, who are tasked with protecting the world from demons and also making sure that mundanes or humans don't know about the magical and supernatural world at all. This particular trilogy is the second contemporary series in the Shadowhunters world, and we are mainly following Emma and Julian, who were introduced in the final book in the Mortal Instruments series, and during all of that stuff that happened in the Mortal Instruments, not really a spoiler because they're only introduced in the last book and it's kind of like a side plot, but Emma's parents end up being killed, and it's kind of chalked up to being part of all of the bad stuff in the Mortal Instruments, but Emma doesn't believe that to be true because her parents were murdered in a different way to everybody else. So when some bodies start to turn up in Los Angeles that seem to have been killed in a similar way to her parents, Emma starts to investigate. So I did enjoy this one. At the end of the day, Cassandra Clare is like good at writing these books. They're fun, they're not too deep, not too serious, they have points of high emotion. She's very good at writing characters that you root for, putting them in situations that makes you kind of emotional. So yeah, I will be continuing. I don't know how I feel about the last hours because I didn't like the infernal devices. I like the characters, but I didn't like that it was historical, but I will at least be finishing out the Dark Artifices. And the very final part of this video is going to be the series that I'm still working on. I'm not up to date on them, but they are not completed series. They still have further installments to be published. There are 9 of these in total. 5 of them I have already spoken about. The first one is Rat Queens by Curtis J. Weeb and Rock Upchurch. This one is an adult high fantasy comic series. There are 8 or 9 installments in this series so far, and I have read 6 of them. We also have the Children of the Whales manga series by Abi Umeda. This one is more of a young adult fantasy, although it does have some quite dark topics in it. I have 10 of these, I think. I've read 8 of them, but I was in a comic book shop recently and I saw at least 17 volumes. So I'm assuming that this is still ongoing, or at least still being translated to English, but I'm unsure about how long exactly this series is going to be. We also have the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, another adult epic fantasy series. There are 4 books published in this series so far. It is going to be 10 books overall, and I have read the first 3. We also have the Skyward series by Brandon Sanderson, which is his young adult sci-fi series. There are 3 books published so far. There's going to be 4 in total. I'm assuming that the 4th one is going to be coming this year, and I've read the first 2. And the last one that I've already mentioned is the Buffy comic reboot. This is a young adult. Apparently it's weird to talk about Buffy as a book with a genre, not like it's Buffy, you know, but it's Buffy in a modernized setting. I'm not sure how many volumes are out of this so far. I think there's at least 5. I've read 2 of them, but it also has multiple spin-offs, including a series that I haven't spoke about yet, which is the Angel reboot. Once again, paranormal. Weird to talk about it, not in relation to it being an Angel reboot, but it's Angel in a modernized setting. This series also, I think, evolves into Angel and Spike. So after the first couple of volumes, it stops being Angel and starts being Angel and Spike. So I have read 1 out of, I think, 2 volumes of Angel, but I'm not sure how many volumes of Angel and Spike follow that. And then there's also a Willow spin-off, and I'm not sure if they're doing any more. There's also crossover issues as well. I am actually really enjoying this. I prefer the art style in Buffy to Angel, but they changed the art style for Buffy in volume 2 and I'm not enjoying it as much, but I'm just kind of going along with these. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, my favorite TV show of all time, also like 50% of my personality, and I wasn't sure how I would feel about these being modernized, but it's actually really refreshing, especially with Buffy, but to a lesser degree Angel as well. The writers have really managed to capture the tone of the characters and also the actors that portrayed them, so I find it to be like a really authentic reboot, and I have really enjoyed my time reading this so far. Might take me a while to catch up though, because there is, in the whole universe, there's multiple series, so that's going to be multiple volumes a year. One that's intentional is the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. This is actually 2 trilogies, but there's no differentiation between them like there is, you know how I said with Mistborn you have era 1 and era 2. With Red Rising it's not quite like that. Like the second trilogy, the 2 books that have been published in it are books 4 and 5. So I have intentionally stopped after the first trilogy because I'm waiting for a solid release date on the final book of the second trilogy. So if you're unfamiliar with Red Rising, check out my best books of the year. This is my favorite series of 2021 as a whole, but this one is an adult sci-fi series. It's also a dystopian, which is a subgenre of sci-fi, but it has dystopian elements within the society of the series, and it's also set in space. We're following this guy called Darrow, who is a red, and there is a color caste system where red is on the bottom and gold is at the top. The reds have the job of mining for this resource called helium-3, which they believe is incredibly important because without helium-3 nobody will be able to terraform the solar system so that people can escape the dying planet Earth. However, after Darrow's wife makes herself a martyr to spur Darrow into action, Darrow goes up to the surface of Mars only to find out that the planets have been terraformed and there are massive cities on them, so the reds are essentially just working because people can make them work. Like there's no grander purpose to it. So Darrow joins the rebellion and infiltrates the golds with the the plan of breaking them apart from the inside. I love this series. It's so dramatic, it is so angsty, the plot twists are amazing, and I'm really excited to start the second trilogy. There has been a couple of websites that have listed conflicting release dates for the third book very recently. One of them said summer 2022, one of them said a little bit later in the year 2022, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we will have a release date for that final book, and as soon as we do, I'm going to read books 4 and 5 so that I'm ready for that, because I love this series, and based on the cliffhanger and the ending of the second book in the first trilogy, I just really don't want to start that second trilogy without knowing when I can read the third one. We then have the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy. This one is once again an indie fantasy romance series, and this one is a King Midas retelling. In this one we are following a woman who has been gold touched by Midas, so her skin, her hair, everything is made out of gold, and she is kept as a prisoner. She's kept in a gilded cage in Midas's palace. When I went into this, I expected, I knew it was King Midas retelling, so I expected a certain set of things from this. It's very different than I expected, and at this point, having read the first book, I still don't know where this series is going, but I'm real intrigued. I gave this 4 stars, but I still think about it. I'm really excited to continue with the sequels. There are 2 more books published in this series so far, and I think that there's going to be 4 in total, and I think that the last one is published in May. I am going to be reading the sequels to this very soon as well, because I'm going to be interviewing Raven Kennedy on my channel in February, and I'm real hyped for it, and I hope you guys are as well, because this is the first time I've mentioned it on my channel. But yeah, really enjoy this one, and if you want to catch that interview and you want to read these, maybe do it soon. And the final series we're going to be talking about today is the Bromance Book Club by Lyssa Kay Adams. This is a series of adult contemporary romances centering around a book club that this group of guys in this town have called the Bromance Book Club. The reason they have this club is so that they can read romantic fiction and understand what women want, what they like, how they want to be treated. And in this first book, we're following this guy who is a pretty famous baseball player, like within the town he lives in, and his wife wants to divorce him because essentially they've just had a breakdown of communication and he's not treating her as well as he could. So he finds out about this Bromance Book Club and joins it and starts reading romance to figure out how to reconnect with his wife. So it's a second chance romance. This was not the most mind-blowing romance I've ever read, but it did provide like a feel-good fluffy romance, which is exactly what I wanted from it. It was a fun read, a light read. There are 4 books in this series so far. I have so far only read the first book, and the 5th one is going to be published in 2022, so hopefully I can finish it this year. So there you have it. Those are all of these series that I did something with in 2021, whether I DNF'd them, finished them, continued them, started them. This is it. This is all of them. I don't know if you can tell, but for the last like 30 minutes of filming, my throat has been hurting more and more, and I want to film more videos today, so I've been talking a lot. I'm gonna leave it there. But in 2022, I really want to, where possible, be reading sequels. I'm gonna see if I can find a way to put it into my goals video that isn't gonna take over my reading, because I obviously already have a lot going on with Bookopoly and my themed vlogs and all of that kind of stuff, but I really would like to make more progress in series in 2022. But down in my comments, please let me know. See if you guys track reading in any way. Let me know how many series you have that you've worked on in 2021. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find links to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Instagram and the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.